Alright, so let's go back to our channel here. Let's say I'm on channel 1 in the 2.4 gigahertz range. Okay, so I got a channel here. Now I'm sort of zoomed in. So here I had 1, 6, and 11. Now we're just going to zoom in on channel 1. And now what I'm worried about is when I actually go to send my signal. Alright. Now we did, oops, I guess I could have written it bigger. So I could just do, I'm going to draw this really big. I can have my signal take up the whole spectrum. That is, you know, every single available bit of that, you know, 4 gigahertz or whatever I'm working with. What is it, 20 megahertz that I want to deal with? I can use all 20 megahertz to send my signal. The thing that's going to happen, though, is if there's just a little bit of interference, oops, if I draw in a little interference here, that little bit of interference is going to destroy my signal. And that means I'm going to have to resend. All right, so a little bit of interference when you're using the whole band is what? Susceptible, vulnerable. Okay, and keep in mind, you know, just like we were talking about frames being delivered, right? If we lose one bit in here, that's the whole frame that's gone. So just this tiny little bit of interference means we have to resend that whole frame. Now instead of that, we could do a thing where we're going to make it so we have a whole bunch of versions of our signal all right, and this way when the interference comes in, the signal makes it through. All right. Now I want to just note on this interference. Let me go back to this one. So I showed you when the signal comes in here and it bounces off. Normally this bouncing off is certain frequencies. So depending on the atomic composition of this wall, it's going to tend to allow some frequencies through and some will bounce off. So that has implications. For example, if we talk here about my neighbor is at 6 gigahertz or 6 megahertz, or on channel 6, their signal is inside their house basically over the whole of channel 6. The part that escapes through their wall is a little bit less than that, and the part that escapes from this and coming through my wall is going to be even less. You all see that? To the point that even if they're using the same channel as I am, when I actually see their interference, it's going to be a small subset of my stuff. That's why I'm drawing this little tiny bit of interference. So interference is usually localized. I'll write that here. Interference to a small bandwidth. So it's really only at certain frequencies that the interference comes through, all right? So lots of copies of the signal. So here we go. If we do the signal over the whole thing, yes, we can use the whole bandwidth, or we can make lots of copies. This is going to be wasteful of the bandwidth. So this is risky. In this method here, it's risky. If there's any interference at all, we're out. In this method, if there's interference, we're likely to get through anyway, but we're wasting our bandwidth because we have all these duplicate signals along the way. The current technique we use, those of you that are familiar with RAID on your hard disk, has anyone heard of RAID hard disk? So this technique here would be like a mirrored discs. You see that? So I got the same signal going over a bunch of different frequencies. The current technique is they have two signals, so I'll put signal 1. Two separate signals, and then they have what's called parity. Okay? And this is like RAID 5 on a disk, where you might have 3 disks and then a parity disk. And the way it works is if there's interference, so interference now is blocking signal 2, signal 1 and the parity still get through, and we can use the parity information to reconstruct the other signal. Okay? So I can lose any of these individually and I'll still be okay. And that's the current technique, because it's not as wasteful. Here, we were wasting the whole thing because it was a duplicate of every signal. Here, we can still send a little bit of extra information, and we only have basically a third of it is wasted. Rock and roll. So here we only get to use a third. Here we can use 2/3. And this is used for, so this is going to mean less is used for compensation of interference. Okay? This is called spread spectrum. Okay? These techniques here. This wouldn't be spread spectrum because you're just using the whole thing. That would be awesome because you get the whole thing. But anyway, so this is spread spectrum, where you're kind of spreading your signal out, duplicating it in some way so that interference isn't going to mess you up. I just want to note one thing. A lot of you guys know Bluetooth. What do we use Bluetooth for these days? Oh, it's in your car to like run the radio now, isn't it? So you can listen to use your phone as the radio or make a call in the, okay. If you have a new fancy car, I know. We all have those. You got an earpiece laying around somewhere, don't you? That you got it when you were like 10 and you're like, man, that's cool. And then now you're like, oh, all those nerds and those things. Anyway, well, here's how Bluetooth works. It worries about the same thing, that there might be interference. So let's say there's interference here. So the way Bluetooth works is if it sends out on this frequency and it finds that there's interference, if there's interference, it does what's called hopping. So it'll hop to a new portion of the channel. Different frequency. So if there's any interference, it drops to a different, or it hops to a different frequency. So what happens, where's all my stuff? That's all right. Bluetooth uses actually one of these channels that we use in the 2.4 gigahertz range, but the signal has the possibility of hopping around within the channel. And just to contrast the two, so this is Wi-Fi up here. What Wi-Fi does is they want to get as many bits per second as they can, and so they'll broadcast over all of these different channels. That uses a lot of electricity. But your phone has a battery in it, and we don't want to waste all that electricity. And so instead of broadcasting on all those different channels at once, just wanting to get the signal through, Bluetooth will hop, and so it's still using the same amount of energy to broadcast. So if it detects interference, it just hops over and broadcasts at the new frequency. It doesn't have to broadcast at all these different places. So you save your battery.
Is Bluetooth normally a higher frequency, like have a larger bandwidth? Is that why the distance is so much shorter for Bluetooth versus like wireless?
No, with Bluetooth it's low power. Remember we talked about the wattage thing? So it's low power, so the signal is actually kind of weaker anyway.
Okay.
And then it does this frequency hopping thing. Just again, it's all about saving power. So we'll call it low power, and we want to save power. Okay, so it doesn't have a really high signal, you know, it doesn't go very far, you guys know that.
Yeah.
It's such low power, it won't go outside a room. But Wi-Fi, you know, here, where we were talking, like here, you know, this is the same power here, but you've got it where, you know, this isn't going to go as far as this up here. And I missed just to note here too, where's my 900 megahertz? Remember I talked about 900 megahertz and I could go outside and down the block? There's so little bandwidth available at 900 megahertz, it's basically enough to make a phone call, and that's all. And so no one uses it for data because it's just not enough bandwidth. I'm a little surprised they didn't use it for Bluetooth, because Bluetooth doesn't use much more data than a phone call. So, but they don't. I guess I'm not a manufacturer, so I don't really know what they're doing.